I'm your Realtor, Keith Hittner Senior, and I want to share with you the best practices for divorce in Minnesota. This is one of a series of videos that we have produced regarding Minnesota divorce facts. This video was recorded from our radio show as we interviewed an experienced divorce attorney on matters of child support, spousal maintenance, the sale of real estate, and much more. All right, Merlin. Merlin Meinertz is attorney at law, family law attorney.
Contact information is?
Yeah, let's do that because I always forget.
Easiest way to find me is www.meinertslaw.com.
Meinertz Law, M-I-N-N-E-R-T-S?
M-E-I.
M-E-I-N-N-E-R-T-S-L-A-W.
Meinertslaw.com.
No dots between.
No dots between.
All right. So, you're broadcasting a career in Sioux Falls, South Dakota.
Well, I started in a small town in southwestern Minnesota in high school.
Okay. What town?
Laverne.
Laverne, all right.
Yeah, the 1964 state basketball champions.
All right.
There you go.
That's the only thing we're known for.
Mm-hmm.
Still got the billboard up down there.
They just
just repainted it.
They just took it down, as a matter of fact. So that's time marches on.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, so you started in there, and then tell us where you. I'm curious how you went from that to
Sure.
broadcast some little television, and all of a sudden you're an attorney.
Yeah, so I started in high school, worked my way through my high school years doing an evening radio show.
Mm-hmm.
I continued on doing that through college. I talked my way through college.
There you go.
That led to a job in television news.
Okay.
In Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Kelloland Television in Sioux Falls, yeah. So I did that, and through that experience got to meet a lot of politicians.
Mm-hmm.
And through that relationship was offered a job in Washington, D.C.
Oh, interesting.
Ended up working in the Senate for 4 years in Washington, which was an incredible experience, but also introduced me to a lot of people who had law degrees.
Mm-hmm.
So I figured at that point, with no other discernible skill or training, that law school was the place for me.
Did you ever then consider going into politics after that?
You know, that was a passion and an interest for a period of time, but it is a young person's game.
Okay.
And you'll find that many Senate offices and House offices are filled with young 20 and 25-year-old people.
That's because they're easy to manipulate. What about Joe Biden? Is that he's not exactly what you call a young person?
He is not a young person. I knew Joe Biden, and he served on the same committee my senator did back in the late 80s, early 90s. So,
what were you doing when you were in the Senate? What was your role or title? Or
I served two functions. For the first senator I worked for, I was a communications director, so managed press relations and interviews and made those types of arrangements for him. And when he lost his re-election bid, I went to work for the other senator
was
from
that
South
a Minnesota?
Dakota.
Oh, South Dakota.
South Dakota
Okay.
senator,
Okay.
yeah. And went to work for that individual as a legislative assistant. And my primary responsibility was commerce, science, and transportation.
Mm.
So airline, railroad, all that kind of stuff.
So 4 years into that, and you decided I'm going to go to law school.
I'm going to go to law school.
Okay,
right?
so
I'm heading into my 30s, and I can either continue this grind
Mm-hmm.
perpetually or find a new way to enhance my credentials, and law school was a logical choice for me.
Okay. What brought you to family law?
Well, I ended law school working for a local Fortune 500 company in their internal litigation department.
Okay.
And I remember the day clearly when they showed me a room about this size filled with bankers' boxes. And I was tasked with going through and summarizing all these arcane contracts and business-related documents. There wasn't a window either, by the way. It didn't take me long to figure out that was not how I wanted to spend the rest of my life. So I made contact after doing some demographic research, figuring out the South Metro, the Lakeville area, was growing at an incredibly fast rate without a lot of attorneys present, and made a connection with a local attorney and hung out my shingle at that point.
So you're in family law. Explain to the people who are listening what family law really entails. What's that mean?
All right. Well, family law is kind of a big blanket umbrella that includes divorces, and within that context, a subset of custody, parenting time, financial support, either in the form of child support, spousal maintenance, property division. It also includes things like paternity cases where people aren't married but still have a child in common and have issues related there too.
How about like wills, estates, probate, and all that? Is that part of that, or is
That,
that a
that
separate?
would be a different
Estate planning,
subspecialty.
yeah.
Okay.
You know.
Okay. So why divorce? Just because the demographics were there, or
Sure. Well, no,
marketing
I think
decision?
I am in a unique position of having a job where I can go home every day knowing I made a tangible difference in somebody's life.
Okay.
There are very few career paths that offer that opportunity. And I can walk people through the valley of the shadow of death, quite really, when people are faced with the end of a marriage relationship and other things. And I can be a conduit for helping to bring some hope and peace into that situation.
So dissolution of marriage is what it is in Minnesota, if I'm not mistaken. When 50% of all marriages are going to end up in divorce. That's what the stats are. And of second marriages and third marriages, the numbers get even worse. In your experience as being intimately involved in all of these things, what are some of the stressors that you see in those relationships that seem to trigger the ultimate decision to separate?
Sure. Well, it goes without saying, number one on the list is usually money, finances, different perspectives on money management, money use, budgeting, not to budget, the use of debt, etc. Financial stressors in and of themselves, chronic unemployment are issues that provide financial stress as well. Another stress on marriages would be either undiagnosed or untreated underlying mental health issues.
Okay.
Depression, anxiety, chemical dependency can lead to an umbrella of all kinds of complicating issues that make both parenting and relating to each other more difficult than usual. And then, third, I think, would be a lack of shared values. People oftentimes get married quickly and without knowing the depth and the heart and the soul of the other person, and find out over the years that person has changed. They're a different person than I thought they were when we were married. And suddenly, a catalyst, by the way, is oftentimes the empty nesters. Kids are
Right.
gone. We
Yeah.
no longer have that shared experience. And who are you and why am I with you?
That's a great point. And gray divorce, as it's called, is becoming a huge thing, especially as our population ages, where you have just exactly that. Kids are off to college or out of the house. You're sitting at the kitchen table looking across the table at this person. You're like, ooh, I don't know if I want to spend the next 30 or 40 years here.
Well, in some cases, I'm working with people in their 70s and their 80s after 50, 60 years of marriage, finally having the decision made to proceed with this matter. So I don't know that I can put my finger on it after that much time. What's the point at this stage in life of making that major decision? But it happens.
That's
So
a
what do you
different.
think?
That's
You
a
just
different
have-
conversation, isn't it?
It is. It
Than
is.
somebody who's in their mid 30s, 40s, kids, all this versus that. It's just a very different dynamic. Can you kind of walk through what's the process for people as they contemplate that decision? When do you get involved? When don't you get? At what point do you get involved? And what's your initial? Do you try to push them to counseling? Do you try mediation? Do you? Yeah, because the comment is always, well, you don't want to, lawyer up. Everybody lawyers up, and lawyers take all the money, right? So talk through some of those stereotypes that you hear of.
Sure. So I have to first say I strongly disagree with that sentiment, and I'll explain why in a moment. Minnesota is a no-fault divorce state. The only thing that's required in this state is that somebody believes there's an irretrievable breakdown in the marriage relationship.
One person or the other.
It does not require a vote. It does not require plurality. Just one person can make that decision on their own. That is a heart-wrenching decision for people to make, and some people have a very high tolerance of pain and will endure all kinds of things for years before making that decision. Others don't like the way he left the toothbrush on the sink, so that's an irretrievable breakdown for me. That's a personal decision. My encouragement to anybody who comes to see me is that as a divorce lawyer, the strangest thing I will tell you is that I believe in the sanctity of marriage. that if there's any way of preserving that relationship, there's great value there. It may not seem like it today, but over time, it'll manifest itself in the value of that extended commitment. So I encourage counseling and other kinds of discernment for purposes of determining whether or not there's an irretrievable breakdown.
But if there is an irretrievable breakdown, that's where you will now.
So I have a question. You talked about that you believe in the sanctity of marriage.
I do.
Okay, I do too. Prerequisites. Do you have them prerequisites that when someone comes to you and say, okay, I want to file for divorce and I want to get divorced, you say, hey, wait a minute. Before we do this, I want you to do this, and this. Do you have anything like that, or?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I always encourage some level of therapy, marriage therapy, counseling. Today, the rage is discernment therapy, someone who can help them discern whether or not there's a basis to continue the marriage. Those are all valuable tools.
Interesting English language here. Discern whether or not there's a basis to continue the marriage, not to determine whether there's a basis to dissolve the marriage. That's interesting.
Well,
it's a little turn, but it's a.
We need something to build on, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you're in a spot
sure.
where you're talking to you, obviously things have gone awry. So
Yeah.
if you don't have anything left to build on,
Right.
then you're done.
Yeah.
Well, and it's not unusual for me to hear from the same person 3 or 4 times over the course of several years,
Okay.
agonizing over this decision.
Yeah.
And usually there's a catalytic event, some sort of substantive outcome that requires them to take the final leap. But people struggle, and rightly so. So I'm more concerned about people who make that decision lightly without a lot of consideration,
Let me ask you
especially
this.
when kids are involved.
This is a DIY society now. There's so many. You can go on to the Minnesota Judicial website, I think it is, and you can go through this little questionnaire thing, and it'll tell you what kind of a divorce. You'll print off, it'll show you all the forms you need, and there's a lot of forms that could be used.
How do you know about all
How-
this?
Why, he's just doing some
I'm
stuff.
I'm just doing prep for the show.
Just kidding.
So anyhow,
Sheila showed him.
Yeah.
she showed.
See what I've
she's
been doing?
on the site. She's
Yeah.
got them printed off in her file.
You saw her in her browsing history.
Anyhow, what's the difference then between using a professional like yourself or doing it myself? Is there some point where it's like, you could just take care of it yourself, you don't need me? And in other words, like, you're crazy if you don't get an attorney involved in this thing, or mediation, or any other methodology to resolve it? What is the advantage and disadvantage if you?
Sure. Well, the easiest way I can answer for your particular situation is that I just sold my house. I could have for sale by owner. I could have tried to muddle through, do it myself, figure out purchase agreements and all the marketing techniques and everything else necessary to get me there. I had the wisdom and knowledge of knowing that someone who does this for a living is probably in a better position than I, who doesn't have the emotion tied to everything else to handle the deal for me. And the same analogy applies in these circumstances, that there's an emotional component here that drives sometimes how people view the world and their expectations
And decisions that they're making.
Right. So you're not always in the best situation to be able to handle that kind of task. But more importantly, it's the implementation. It's the implementation of how these things are put together in the form of the final decree. You can fill out your own paperwork, and there is, I'd say, close to 50% of the divorces, at least in Dakota County, are pro se, people choosing to represent themselves, fill in the document, and move forward from there. That's an alternative. People can choose to do so. The value added is having advice from someone who knows what your options are and can clearly explain what those options are, and more importantly, which option works best for you in your circumstance. I do not live in a one-size-fit-all world. I do not live in a check-a-box world, because if you only have 2 alternatives, but you're looking for alternative 3 and it's not available to you, then what do you do? So, there are certainly those uncomplicated situations. No kids, short-term marriage,
Low
no
assets.
maintenance, low assets.
Yeah. Rental.
Go ahead.
The biggest thing they got is a lease.
It's seriously true that I'm handle more cases where I'm trying to correct the mistakes that were done early on. In some cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars that were lost or otherwise misappropriated, that and it becomes tragedy, because at some point property divisions are final. They're not modifiable absent very limited circumstances like fraud, misrepresentation, excusable neglect, those types of things. I'll give you an example. Someone went through the process, filled out their own paperwork, sold their house, split the equity 50-50. What he didn't understand at the time is that he had an unmarital interest in the property by virtue of having equity in the house on the day they got married. He gave up over $100,000, not knowing that that would have, without question, been restored to him. He comes in after the fact, after finding out that reality, and was sadly out of luck.
What about things that happen down the road? I'll give you an example of a case where a divorce took place and there were children involved, and it was agreed that Mrs. would stay in the house until the kids got out of high school, and then they would sell the house at that time. And it all sounded good that day. Fast forward 10 years, kids are now graduating. He's in Florida somewhere with somebody else. She goes to sell the house, can't find him, don't know where anyone is, but he still has equity in the house. Finally, we found the guy, and now, of course, he wants,
Show me the money.
show me the money. Is there a way that you can protect against a scenario like that? Number one, I suppose that's what you would look at is, what happens. You're always looking at what happens then. But what happens if somebody wants to buy a house today? They're still married, but they need to secure a living place for the kids that are going to be shared. So they need to secure these places prior to the divorce. Is there a way to work around that?
Absolutely. So there are a variety of ways of creating that dynamic. The first and most common way is just doing a property settlement buyout. If there's equity in the house, either a buyout of that share of the equity or a trade for other assets of value. If there's money, for example, in a 401k that can be traded away for some equity in the house with an appropriate level of tax effect. A financial planner would tell you that it's probably foolish to give up on retirement assets that are going to be difficult to rebuild, but there's value to stability in the housing relationship. That was very common, of course, when rates were favorable, and now that rates are creeping up, it's becoming more and more difficult. And on that same topic, as I'm sure you understand, that intertwines with the issue of spousal maintenance and child support. Can that be used as available income for purposes of qualifying for a mortgage? Because it's not just buying out the other party's interest, it's releasing them from liability on that underlying mortgage. Many people don't understand that remains an obligation to the party
On
who
paper,
signed a promissory note. It shows up on your credit report. In the event of a default, it'll affect your credit score, so there are lingering implications. The other alternative is what we call a marital lien, L-I-E-N, a lien against the property like a mortgage lien. So I give you a marital lien for X number of dollars that matures upon certain events.
Yeah.
So I'll pay you upon our either party's
15
death
years,
or
15 years from now, the
remarriage.
house is worth $500,000 more, and this guy wants half the equity.
Yeah, exactly.
Is what
Or
the scenario sounds
reverse. I
Oh,
lived
yeah.
through
like.
2007 and
Sure,
2008.
values are down. Now what?
People committed to specific percentages or specific dollar amounts based on the 2007 value.
Yeah.
The lien matured 5 years later, and there wasn't even enough equity to pay out that lien. So that's an area for serious caution, and a percentage lien as opposed to a fixed dollar amount lien may be advisable.
Yeah.
So
You're
would you then
tying it to something that's variable,
Exactly.
right?
Would you then generally advise against something like that then? Some long-term or, commitment that
So as a general rule, I would say avoid as many entanglements with a former spouse as possible. If there is a way to release them from having an interest in your real estate, do so. If there's a way of releasing them from, being a co-borrower on a car loan, do so. If there's a way of releasing them from being on a joint bank account, do so. Because it's the entanglements after the fact that create some real funky outcomes that are oftentimes very difficult to unravel.
Yeah. Co-parenting with an ex-spouse is going to be enough
Yeah, trust me.
entanglements
No
to
doubt.
deal with moving
No doubt.
forward.
We'll go.
Okay, so
we'll have a
I want
couple more
when we come
questions,
back,
yeah.
I want to talk about children. and how that impacts a couple after the divorce, going forward, the obligations and rights and privileges and so forth. Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. We're with Merlin Meinertz, a family law attorney, MEINERTS law.com.
Got it.
Nailed it.
Fourth segment.
Nailed it.
Nailed it.
All right, Kelvin, you had a question before. I want to talk about kids, but
All that. Yeah, we at the end of the second segment, we were talking about just kind of debunk the thought that everybody has to lawyer up when you go into divorce, and that they take all the money, they look at your assets, they look at income, and that's how they determine their fees and all this stuff that sits out there. Just address it, just address
the
that
elephant in the room.
Yep.
Sure. So, and by the way, 40% of my practice is alternative dispute resolution. So I do a lot of mediation. I do a lot of early neutral evaluation, moderated settlement conferences where I'm working as a neutral.
Okay.
So I have that background and that inclination to begin with.
So
can
you work with both parties in a divorce or not, or is that not wise?
So here's the ethical guideline.
Okay.
One person cannot provide legal advice to two people simultaneously, kind of like the dual relationship in real estate. I can't know husband's goals and objectives and bargaining positions and then know wife's similar information and try to effectively represent both people simultaneously. It's an absolute ethical quagmire, so that's prohibited, at least under the rules as it relates to lawyers. So I think that the fear factor relating engaging in a lawyer is ill-founded, only because most all of the mediations I handle involve people coming in with lawyers who are there to equip them and give them their advice as to their best circumstance, something a neutral can't do. You can go see a mediator, but that mediator should be ethically bound and prohibited from attempting to give advice to anybody. There are some mediators who function out there who aren't lawyers, so they certainly can't dispose of legal advice in that circumstance either. So the value added is having that information that's particularly designed to your circumstance that helps you make the best decision for you. And I would say that the other misnomer is that most lawyers I know, most all lawyers I know with very few exceptions, are not litigious in nature. They're collaborative. They believe in the alternative dispute resolution process. And, things have morphed over the years since I began practicing 30 years ago when, the model was the bulldog attorney. Let's go get them. And it's really more well-designed now to be collaborative in nature. Let's work together to fix the puzzle as opposed to creating more complication.
Especially when there's kids involved. Because
even more so,
the attitudes that result from that battlefield, will last for decades.
For sure.
And spills over. Let's talk about that. How about there's fewer marriages now than there ever has been, because people are just cohabitating and they're having kids, they're buying real estate and all that stuff, but they separate too, they split up too. How is that handled? And do you get involved in that at all?
Most certainly. Well, as to the parenting part of the puzzle, that's a little more complicated, because under Minnesota law, until paternity is adjudicated and until there is an order, biological mom has sole physical custody, and father doesn't have any rights to that child.
Even if they're on the birth certificate?
Even if they're on the birth certificate, until or unless they bring a motion to establish custody and parenting time. So they're quite literally hanging out there. These paternity situations are happening with great frequency, and the most troubling ones are people who don't even know each other, right? They hook up at some event and voila, we have a child. We don't know each other, but now we're going to spend the next 18 years of our lives, and in fact probably a lifetime, having to have this co-relationship involving a child.
So if I have no rights, then does that mean I don't have to pay child support?
Well, interestingly enough, if the other party were to apply for child support, they'd be awarded child support. Interesting thing about child support, it's based not just upon your gross monthly income, but upon what's called a parenting expense adjustment, the number of overnights that you spend with a child per year.
Okay.
So if the child support is going to be established, but there's no parenting time order, technically that father gets zero for a parenting expense adjustment because there's no recognized court-ordered parenting time.
So then that amount would be higher than
Would
lower.
be higher than necessary.
So is that
right?
different in a married situation? So
No, the same guidelines apply, that child support is based on gross incomes and your percentage
I
of
mean the
parenting
paternity
time.
situation.
Oh, no. If you are married, you are presumed to be the father.
Okay.
That is irrebuttably presumed that you're the father if you're married when a child is born.
Let's talk about kids that are
Hold on. Do you have questions to follow up on
Yeah,
that?
just my question then. You'd said that the mother has 100% sole custody of that child. You were referring to situations where people are not married.
Paternity cases,
Okay.
right.
Got it.
What about kids who are over 18?
Well, they're emancipated adults. They're not even under the jurisdiction of the
So
court.
they don't even come into. So we don't have an obligation to put them through college or to pay their insurance or to take care of them. They're still living
Their
in the
cell
house.
phone bill, their
Cell phone,
yeah, all that stuff.
All that stuff.
Your technical obligation for child support lasts until emancipation, which most typically is graduation from high school. It can continue up to age 20 if that person's still in high school. If for some reason there's a delay in their graduation. But there is no court-imposed obligation to support an adult child. There's no court-imposed obligation to commit to college expenses or other expenses. You know, the one most voluntary outcome is health insurance, where you can continue an adult child until age 26. Many parents voluntarily choose to do that, but that's not contained within the party's divorce decree.
That's a
free
family
and
decision.
separate voluntary
And if
decision.
mom wants to do that and dad's like, I'm not paying for that deal, then that's on mom or vice versa.
There's no legal recourse to get there, right? But to your ultimate point, you know, we do a lot of research and have had a lot of training lately as lawyers and family law professionals about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. The higher your ACE score, the higher the predictor of future dysfunction as a child. One ACE score relates to parents who are divorcing. You can add another ACE score if that's a high conflict situation. Add in chemical dependency or incarcerations and other things, your ACE scores get through the roof. The higher the ACE score, the higher the likelihood of anxiety, depression, adult-related dysfunction. And we're seeing that quite directly with respect to kids in custody situations really suffering. And there is an absence of good mental health care because it's very, very difficult these days to even find an available therapist. Waiting lists are 90, 120 days before you're even able to get the kids help in that type of context. So it's really concerning.
So kids listening, mental health field, go into it.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's true. I think that's true.
All right, so Merlin Meinertz, MEINERTS, law.com. Family law attorney, if you've got a situation that you want to discuss, please go on that website, and I'm sure there's a capture form there that they can fill out some contact information, reach out to you,
Indeed.
and just have a consultation there, Kelvin.
Walk through a little bit, if you would. How do you figure out income and spousal maintenance with kids and without kids?
How much time do we have?
Yeah,
2 minutes and 35 minutes.
2 minutes, 35 seconds. Well, the easiest people are W-2 wage earners, right, who have a fixed salary, a fixed hourly rate. It is your income based on that calculation. Then the next layer of people who also have discretionary fluctuating income in the form of discretionary bonuses, commissions, etc. So that's an important consideration. Bonus commission income is part of your income structure, but those professions, real estate and otherwise, where there's a great variability,
Right.
it's important to take a long-term look at an average as opposed to just considering one peak year or one valley year. The most challenging is with self-employed people,
Right.
where there is either an underreporting of available income because of cash under the table, etc., or an over-reporting of expenses because personal expenses are disguised as business-related expenses. So those are all challenges and important things that need to be considered.
A really important reason to use someone like yourself to go through that, because that's the piece where it probably get
Is
really
that with,
complicated.
what about
right?
spousal maintenance, though? That's true with child support. How about spousal maintenance? When does that come into play? Or is that just not even a thing anymore?
Well, so no, it is still definitely a thing. It's the statute provides for spousal maintenance in cases where generally a long-term marriage with an older dependent spouse. The way I would quite quickly identify it is looking at that spouse's need in the form of a budget that must be consistent with the standard of living during the marriage, not extravagantly out of the question or different than what the parties enjoyed together. What's her ability to meet that need through her own resources or his own resources? And these days, spousal maintenance is an equal opportunity question because both spouses tend to be married, generating income. So what is the ability to meet that need? If there's a level of underemployment, it's very difficult in this office environment or this economic environment to argue you can't find a job. So people are expected to be as self-sufficient as possible. Then the third question is, if there is a shortfall, does the payor spouse have the ability to make up for that difference?
Well, then the other thing is, I mean, obviously you're splitting two households. The fact you're not going to have two households with that same standard of living.
It's mathematically impossible.
Right.
So oftentimes, some judges and others take the approach of income equalization in terms of finding the sweet spot of available income to be shared between the parties so they're both similarly situated.
All right, we could talk for another hour here, but we're out of time. This is Real Estate Chalk Talk. I'm Keith Hittner Senior, and over the years we have helped hundreds of clients who are working through divorce proceedings. The sale of real estate and the distribution of the proceeds as a result of those proceedings is part of that process. Watch all the videos in this series and any additional videos as they become available. Subscribe to be notified as new information is added and updated.